Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
A couple people sent me this story. I honestly thought it was a joke or an onion story or something else. And when you stop to think about it, you can kind of see what's going on here, but it still seems to me to be a little crazy. The Washington State High Court is going to hear a case about transit fare enforcement. So you get on mass transit, for which you're supposed to buy a ticket or pay through a card, and somebody walks up to you and go, "Excuse me, can you prove to me that you paid to be on this?" And the question is, does that violate your constitutional rights to be asked if you paid to get on the bus? So out of Seattle, the Associated Press ran it, as did KIRO. The Washington State Supreme Court will consider whether fare enforcement on public transit represents an unconstitutional incursion into passengers' right to privacy. Now, lower courts have thrown this out, but it's a lawsuit brought by a man who, in 2018, was riding on a bus, and a county sheriff's deputy asked him, basically, "Can you show us that you paid?" The Seattle Times reported that the man's lawyer argues that that act of simply asking violated his civil rights under the state constitution. Now, if this man's case is successful, transit agencies could be stripped of the authority granted by the state to ask riders for evidence that they either bought a ticket or tapped their ORCA card, the ORCA card. And here's the thing. They're not saying they can't enforce the fare. They're saying they can't just randomly ask people if they've paid. But even that, to me, seems a stretch. The implications for Sound Transit, King County Metro's Rapid Ride, and the other counties' community transit and other agencies that employ fare enforcement officers are significant. Fare collection remains a large part of the budgets for those organizations. Sound Transit calculates it'll take in $8.3 billion in fares between now and 2046. I don't know why they chose a date so far out in the future, but apparently that was important to them. They said if we have a gap that fare is not covering, then it's going to have to come from somewhere else. There are statewide ramifications for transit in Washington State that will flow from this case, says the deputy prosecuting attorney with the county prosecutor's office who's representing the state in the case. Now, the attorney who's representing the man at the center of the case, he rejects that idea. He said this is simply addressing unlawful search and seizures by law enforcement officers. The government could conduct investigations without any reasonable suspicion or any suspicion of unlawful activities simply because they want to make sure the law is being enforced, he said. Most people say yes, exactly. And remember that searches and seizures can be considered anything as trivial as, I don't know, chalk on a tire, all the way up to, them busting your door down with a battering ram and coming inside and tossing the place, as they say. And so the question is, how intrusive is the search? How unreasonable is the search? And if somebody walks up to you and says, "Do you have your ticket?" for instance, "Do you have your ticket?" Is that, which end of the spectrum is that at? This man's case relies on whether fare enforcement officers asking for proof of payment constitutes a warrantless seizure or restraint. The attorney for the man argues yes, because in that moment, the man has no choice but to engage with the officers, except that the officers have a reason for engaging. Okay? And that's the question. We'll get to that in a second. The Court of Appeals said that the man had consented to the officer's questioning by boarding the bus in the first place. Everyone knows that when you get on the bus, you got to tap your ORCA card or pay, and you probably also suspect that someone might walk by and say, "Excuse me, did you pay?" So the argument is similar, however, to one made in Maryland last year, where that state's highest court sided with the passenger, concluding it was a Fourth Amendment constitutional right against a suspicionless search and seizure, and it was violated when the agency conducted a fare sweep. So the agency would apparently just go on to buses or trains or whatever it is and just walk down the aisle checking tickets. And they said, well, you're just doing that randomly. That's not fair. But there they actually called it out as a suspicionless search. So this plaintiff is not asking for the courts to say that the people in charge of the authority can never ask for proof of payment. Presumably, if they saw someone get on and walk around without doing anything to pay or tap their Orca card, then they could say, excuse me, can you please show me that you've paid? Because they would have a suspicion about it. And in the Maryland case, it was specifically about a suspicionless search. They walked up to people, they had no reason to suspect they hadn't paid, and said, have you paid? So meanwhile, an attorney with the Washington Defender Association said this case is simply asking the court to affirm the status quo that limits searches and seizures. And a lot of people are going to say, well, if that's a status quo, what's been happening for the last few decades? In its response to the plaintiff's petition, the state says the man had no reasonable right to privacy as a passenger. Anyone could have watched him boarding and riding the bus. And by the way, there was no personal information divulged in asking him for proof of payment. They didn't say, what's your name? Who's your daddy? Can you show us any ID? They didn't ask for anything. They just said, can you show us that you paid to get on the bus? Can you show us that? So officers engaging with individuals in public and asking for identification does not qualify as a seizure, the state argued. But again, here they're not asking for identification. They're simply saying, can you show us evidence that you've paid to be here? And, it's one of these things. Michigan's mass transit is pretty much non-existent. Theoretically, there are buses that run certain routes, and there's a thing downtown Detroit called the People Mover. The People Mover. It's pointless, but I won't go there right now. But there are obviously places where mass transit is extremely important, okay? And so you got your systems in New York and Boston and so on. And so the question becomes, what will happen if the High Court of Washington says they can no longer randomly ask people to show proof that they paid to be on the mass transit? What then? Well, what'll presumably have to happen then is you'll have to have somebody stand there and watch as people get on. Now, I know in the old days, that is prior to today, we probably would have assumed that the person operating, if there is an operator on the vehicle, that the person operating it would be the one who'd watch that. So you're getting on a bus, and the bus driver would turn and watch people get on. But of course, that's giving the bus driver an extra task, because the bus driver is also opening and closing doors, watching how many people are on board the bus, getting ready to move, watching the clock, whatever else they're doing. And I don't know, and my friends in Washington can tell me this, whether all of these devices that people are traveling on are manned. Are they all piloted by somebody? And the reason I say that is the People Mover, for instance, in Detroit, is this raised monorail kind of thing that goes around. And it's not a monorail, but it's on a fixed track, and it's raised and elevated, and it goes around a loop around amongst the most important buildings in downtown Detroit. It is not operated by a physical human being on the vehicle. The People Mover is operated remotely, and I presume there's somebody somewhere in charge, I hope. But there's not somebody watching as you get on. And so to get onto the People Mover, they've got turnstiles, and you got to buy tokens and all this stuff. At least you used to. It's been a while since I've been on it. And in this case, you can presumably either pay as you get on, or use a ticket that you just paid, or use one of those cards that you tap, an Orca card. And so presumably you'd have some kind of evidence you show somebody to prove that you did that. But if they can't ask randomly, they can, of course, ask people they saw get on who didn't pay or didn't appear to pay, because that would not be suspicionless. But they'd have to have somebody standing there watching the whole time to watch for people. And that, of course, is the concern, because if that means you got to put another person on every single vehicle, now you just jacked up the cost of mass transit for everybody. And there are going to be people out there who are going to say, Steve, that's fine. I'll pay a little more if they can't come by and randomly ask me for proof I paid. I'm not sure that's how I like that equation to be balanced out, but then again, I'm not in Washington. So this is up to you guys on the West Coast. KIRO reported Kelvin and Caleb both sent it. Caleb's my West Coast reporter. Washington High Court to hear a case about transit fare enforcement. The Associated Press, of course, wrote it, and KIRO ran it. And questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. It is totally unproductive to think that the world has been unfair to you. Every tough stretch is an opportunity.